So, welcome to the stage, Amanda Willett. She is the founder of the Trauma Wise Institute, and she is a leading authority on trauma responsive organizations, as well as a seasoned professional in industries like mining and nuclear. And she's got 2 decades of experience in executive leadership, HR, and trauma informed care. And she specializes in those high risk industries, just like mining and finding ways to help them develop resilient and inclusive cultures that not only can withstand uncertainty but can thrive in it. And Amanda, I think that's really what we all want to know is how do we take these uncertain times and flip them into something, just like Heather said, that's an opportunity. And I also want to bring in your term here, which is trauma responsive culture. And I'd just love for you to unmute yourself before you answer the question I'm about to pose here. There we go. Awesome. Okay. So what does it mean to build a trauma responsive culture in mining? And how do you see that differs from the more traditional approaches? Obviously, safety and well-being are so important. We know that our people are valuable. We know we need to take care of their safety. What does trauma responsive have to do with that? Or how does it differ from the traditional approaches that are out there right now?
Yeah, so if we look at mining, nuclear, or other high risk industries, we know that safety has really traditionally meant physical safety. And so I think
Mm,
there's a common thread here today in the conversations that will be taking place. And, when we look at physical safety, we think about personal protective equipment, we think about hazard prevention, and we think about compliance protocols. So a trauma responsive culture doesn't replace those, but it builds on them. And so it really addresses what we don't always see. So it addresses things
mm.
like stress, moral injury, harassment, and really the cumulative trauma that quietly undermines both performance and safety. And so it shifts us from a place of asking, what's wrong with you, to what happened to you. And how
Mm,
can we support healing, performance, and retention in the workplace? And so this approach really considers what's known as the invisible injuries that affect our teams every day. And it really recognizes that culture is a safety system too. And so when culture is reactive, when it's fragmented, when it's dismissive of human needs, psychological risks obviously rise, and so does turnover. And so trauma responsive leadership really creates conditions where people can feel seen, where people can feel supported and safe to perform at their best. And so it's not just about physical safety, but mental, emotional, and social.
Thank you so much for that wisdom packed answer, Amanda. You dropped so many pearls of wisdom there that I'd love to unpack with you. I love the term culture is a safety system. And I think that's something maybe we've all experienced that. We've been in an organization where it's not safe to ask questions, it's not safe to speak up. People don't care about you, they're not checking in with you. You feel sort of alone.
Yeah.
And we know what that feels like, right? And it definitely, of course, it makes a difference. And I'm interested to know what challenges or how are you seeing this manifest in the mining industry right now that have you convinced that the change that you're speaking about is really urgent, essential to moving forward and having us thrive.
Yeah, so I think we can all agree that we're operating when it comes to mining and other high risk industries in really high stress, high risk environments. And so
Mm,
we're looking at, not only transient workforces, we're looking at isolation, we're looking at chronic pressure to produce, which all of
mm,
these things can really amplify things like trauma. Also burnout, mental health struggles, and especially if workers like don't feel supported. And so if it's breeding that toxic work environment, workers are not going to feel supported. And so there's many DEI and mental health efforts out there, but they're really still very reactive or very surface
mm,
level. And so they're not really embedded into leadership culture or into organizational policy. And, that's where I see a really big gap. And so as a result, of course, we're going to see things like a rise in turnover, a rise in absenteeism, and also a rise in, that, what's the term, quiet quitters, and
Yeah.
disengagement. So people are showing up physically, but they're mentally checked out. And so they're also emotionally checked out because like they no longer feel safe, they no longer feel valued or seen. And so the systems that once worked, which we're all familiar with, like EAPs, compliance checklists, and traditional leadership training, they're really no longer enough, especially post-pandemic,
Mhm.
or what I like to say, post-trauma world. It means
Mhm.
really needing to move beyond that checkbox culture. And so beyond mandatory training that doesn't really stick, and beyond wellness programs that only apply during, say, off hours. We know that when we ignore emotional or relational harm, we actually risk the entire system. So we were talking about culture as a safety system. And I've really seen companies that have spent millions on equipment and absolutely zero on their people's internal safety, only to watch, morale collapse, and culture erode. And so that's why my work really focuses on the whole health, because the culture we create is a safety system.
Hmm. Wow, that's such a powerful image of all the monies out there. All, this is what we value. This is what we think is going to make us successful as a business, is to buy the best equipment and to, invest in the best safety equipment, for example, that kind of thing. Like there's such a positive intention there. You can see it. And yet, as you're saying, if it doesn't actually create the internal conditions that people need to feel their best and perform their best within the workplace, it isn't ultimately going to be enough, right? And they're still, despite the best technology, they may still struggle from
Mhm.
turnover. And I can imagine some of the mining leaders that are listening are maybe thinking, oh my gosh, like we've got an EAP, we've got personal protective equipment, we've got mandatory training, we've done all this, and it's not enough. Like, what can we do then? And I'd just love for you to speak maybe directly to them, maybe offer a little bit of reassurance or some action that they could take. What is one shift or strategy that you could recommend for the leaders on the call or watching the replay later to start
Mhm.
implementing now toward this direction that you're talking about, which might feel like a bit of a stretch goal? It might feel maybe a little bit impossible. Maybe they're thinking, I can't
Well,
control how people feel. What am I supposed to do? I'd love it if you could just offer maybe one shift or strategy they could start with.
yeah, sure, absolutely. So, I'm going to say what would be common sense probably to most. So start with your leadership because culture is shaped at the top. And so when we look at
Mm.
what do we do to start with our leadership? Well, yes, more training. But even starting small, like training frontline managers in things like emotional regulation and things like trauma responsive communication can really dramatically shift trust, it can shift retention and engagement.
Okay. I wish I had all day to talk to you, Amanda. This is really fascinating. I would love to know what trauma responsive communication sounds like, but I do see that Heather has maybe a question or something she wants to
Sure.
interject into the conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
Go ahead, Heather.
Mm. If that's okay, and if it's okay for me, then it's okay.
For
We encourage
anybody.
anyone to come to
Yeah.
the table and ask questions around this. And so, Amanda,
Yeah.
just before, and I love where you're going with this. However, I'm curious. So, if it's largely invisible
Mhm.
initially, like you said, until
Mhm.
you get and you see that there's increased retention, lack of retention. But I'm just wondering because I can imagine um, you want to take action on this before it gets to that stage. You want to take action on this before it gets where it's really affecting your employees' um, productivity, their engagement at work. And I was just wondering as well, how can leaders recognize or how do they know or what can some kind of signs, whether it's industry trends or what's going on, that they need to take the action now, and that would save so much of potential trauma that you've obviously seen in many, many companies over the years?
Hmm. Well, you know, I think obviously I talked earlier about changing the conversation from what's wrong with you
Yeah, I
to what
love that.
happened to you. So that's how we move to a culture of compassion and understanding, right? So what we don't know, we don't know. And everything begins with awareness, right? That's our first step. And so rather than, and I think Cheryl is going to speak about this later, but rather than you know, it's the speak up culture. So it's also being able to recognize your own trauma responses.
Mm,
So in yourself and learning that emotional intelligence and regulation and having the right tools. And so one of the things I developed is a trauma responsive leadership framework. And so it's a really a multi-phase roadmap that helps leaders move from awareness to measurable, sustainable change.
mm. Thank you.
I love what you're saying, Amanda, about self-awareness, and maybe that is the small step, right? That people can take now, is to recognize how what am I bringing to the table? Am I disengaging? Am I failing to check in with people as a leader, even though that's part of my job, to make sure that people feel connected and supported, as well as having the information that they need to do their job. And, I think we might all be familiar at this point with fight, flight, fawn, or freeze, the
Yeah.
four classic responses. When something in our nervous system is too overwhelming, we feel we can't deal with it. We know we either need to push back against that threat, we need to run away, avoid it, right? Or we need to maybe do something else that might feel like a good idea, because our internal system is in that survival mode if we perceive a threat.
Yeah.
So
And you know, one of those things is having the tough conversations that nobody wants to have.
yeah, stay regulated, stay present. Yeah, I really think that's it's easy to say, isn't it? But it can
Yeah.
be so powerful when that shift comes up in the underground, in the shift meeting, in that moment when there's a situation we need to react to, or a person we need to deal with. It can make all the difference.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
Awesome. Okay. Well, Amanda, thank you so much. This has been
Thank you.
fantastic. I just have one more question for you. I
Sure.
understand that you are working on a new book. It's going to be
I
called
am.
The Leadership Movement: Setting the Gold Standard for Culture Transformation. So you didn't mention trauma in there, but I'm assuming that it's covered. And I would love to hear just a little bit more about that. When can we read it? And how's the writing going?
Yeah, so it's going really well. I'm really excited about this project. And so the leadership movement is really a call to action for leaders who are ready to redefine what safe, inclusive, and high performing cultures really look like, starting with mining. And so it offers a roadmap for trauma responsive leadership that really goes beyond policies and programs to truly transform how we lead, communicate, and support our people. And so we know at this time during the DEI being challenged all around the world and stress levels rising with a lot of uncertainty in the world in general, this book is really going to be a highlight. It's going to highlight leaders, like leading people in mining who are pushing forward, those who are brave enough to lead with empathy, transparency, and strategy. And I'm going to be interviewing mining executives and HR professionals who are going to be featured in the book, as well as safety leaders and other change makers starting in September. And so, new year, it will come to life, I hope. So it will be published probably early 2026. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, congratulations on that. It
Thank
sounds
you.
fascinating. I'm sure we have lots of leaders that are on the call with us right now live who really resonate with the message that you're sending, and the strength that it takes to lead with that empathy and transparency. It's so important, and it's so powerful. So thank you so much, Amanda, for being with
Thank
us.
you.
If you want to get in touch with Amanda and learn more, or maybe be one of the interviews in her book, we would love to have you reach out to her directly. We've popped her LinkedIn contact in the chat, and we'll also make sure that it's shared under this interview when it's posted. So thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you for being with us, and good luck with the book, and really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts with us today.
Thank you, Erica. I'm looking forward to hearing the other speakers.